let's see. Welcome everybody to this, the next to last session that we're doing before we're going to take a break for the whole month of July. And today's theme is on public health. So first little piece of warning for anybody who's new just joining in and for this session. There's an inner circle, outer circle dynamic. We've been doing these sessions every Wednesday morning since the first week of January. This I think is maybe our 24th session or 23rd, something like that. And there's an ongoing group that are kind of deep into a conversation. So there's a little inner circle dynamic with that. And then people that are new will be more outer circle. It's all fairly simple stuff. So just roll with it. But some of the things we won't have time to stop and go through. This is one of the ongoing themes from just 2 weeks ago. And I hope Park Howell shows up because this came up with him. He did a little experiment trying to get ChatGPT to improve the narrative index for a text. And what ChatGPT did, we've termed butt ramming. Basically, it just jammed a bunch of butts into sentences randomly. Said, "Here, there's your score. Way to go." And that's the state of the art right now with AI and ChatGPT. We are without a doubt hitting a tipping point with the ABT. I saw this coming last fall, and that's why I decided to start doing this weekly discussion thing. Is I could see a lot of people are picking up on it. And now every week I'm getting things, including just this morning, a good friend of mine sent me this website that I have not seen, but this I think might be somebody in the UK. And by Reckon Better, this is a service. They're monetizing the ABT along with these other things. And take a look at what they've got. It says choose your narrative structure and improve your abstract in seconds. So this is for scientists or whoever. And their number one tool there is the ABT. Doesn't make any mention of where they learned about it from. They've got a firecracker with it that I guess signifies, how powerful it is. The problem is it is not one of four different options for narrative structure. I don't think they really know quite what they're talking about. And we can go on and on about that. Everything else is derived downstream from the tripart structure of the ABT. And the crazy thing here is they're offering up a service that makes it seem like narrative structure is something you can just fix overnight. I would compare this to imagine the same sort of thing where instead of choose your sport and improve yourself in seconds, here, sign up with us and we could teach you surfing or skydiving or base jumping or gator wrestling overnight. And by tomorrow, we'll make you an expert thanks to AI in it. It just doesn't happen that quick. Narrative intuition is something that's built over a lifetime and they're fooling themselves. What this is, I wrote about it in my first book. Larry Cuban was a guy at Stanford who wrote a number of books on the history of educational technology. And every innovation that comes along in educational stuff instantly gets locked onto by the business community. They overhype it. They call it a panacea. And then everybody buys into it in a big way. And then they find out the reality of no, it's not a panacea. And that just happens over and over again. So we'll talk some more about that. Today's session, we've got three wonderful guests focusing on public health. And I think the way we'll run this is the first half hour is mostly just going to be my chatting with them. The second half hour will be the usual group discussion because we've got three people and I've kind of got a topic in mind for each of the three of them. Next week will be our final session before our break for the whole month of July. And that is going to focus on law, especially with our good friend Patrick Barone, who's one of our longtime group members here. And he's got this series of articles he's writing in this magazine right now, Journal of Science and the Law. And the most recent installment was about why lawyers must embrace the ABT. It's really nice. He wrote a great presentation on the ABT, why it's so powerful and important for lawyers. And of course, Doug Passon is the other lawyer in our group that co-authored the law version of that Narrative Gym book with me. So the bottom line is this stuff is spreading all over the place now, the ABT. And here's a little bit of the focus for what I want to talk about here in the first half hour is what I'm increasingly calling the conundrum. And this is one of the guys that's important to us. 3 years ago, Christopher Lochhead is kind of one of the business communication gurus from Silicon Valley. He was on Park Howell's podcast and he was talking about how fond they and his group are of the ABT. And he said the reason we like it so much is because it's very related to one of their fundamental rules, which is nobody buys a solution without a problem. And when he said that on the podcast, instantly it resonated with us. And ever since then, we use it all the time in our training. This is really a lot of the starting point. It's the mistake that you see happen over and over again from heavily educated people. They come up with brilliant solutions and they fail to really make sure that there's actually a problem out there with the audience. We talk about how that happened in the state of North Dakota with conservation issue. It's what happened with the whole climate movement. They came up with cap and trade, a solution when the general public wasn't about to act on things in 2010. It's what happened with the pandemic. They came up with these wonderful vaccines with the assumption that everybody viewed it as a life and death problem and would use take the vaccine immediately. We're stunned to find out a third of the public just said it's just not that big of a problem. We don't want to be injected. Nobody buys a solution without a problem. It's such a fundamental dynamic. And it's the challenge for us, and it's been the challenge for me for 30 years now, trying to be involved with this topic of science communication with an entire community, science and the medical world, over and over again. They mostly just don't view this as a problem. They give it lip service. Oh, we should communicate better. But when you start getting in there and telling them how hard it is to actually change things, they're not they don't see it as that important of a priority. The problem has been in the past, it's all qualitative when you try and motivate them. Say, look, you're not communicating very well. And they say, well, we think we are. But what we've come across now, I've been developing for 10 years, is now a quantitative tool to be able to show data to say, look, this is the level you're communicating at in terms of drawing a narrative structure, which is the fundamental element for effective communication. And this is the simple index I came up with 10 years ago, simply the ratio of buts to ands. And why does this make sense? Because the whole ABT, the first two elements are and but. They are the fundamental building blocks of narrative structure. And so it would make sense to quantify them. So here's a little bit of stuff we've been doing in the past few weeks, and I just want to introduce this as part of our setup, which is Matthew, David, and Liz Strauss and I have been hard at work in this new book, Lincoln but Trump. This is one of the things we present there. And what we did was look at the four different types of editorials in the New York Times and calculate this narrative index and just kind of ask the question, do they all communicate equally well, or are there some differences? And yes, they're very clear differences. So in general, looking at the y-axis there for the narrative index, a score of under 10 is bad, around 10 is pretty lame. Most politicians score in the mid-teens. The really good ones are in the 20s. And what you see there is their editorials that come out from their editorial board are committee exercises, a dozen people all weighing in. So it's a mixture of voices. And as a result, it doesn't have a very clear, strong argument. Each of these is based on 25 that we chose starting in February going backwards. You see in the middle are the guest essays from people from the outside world or the individual members of the editorial board. And then on the right, averaging almost 30, are their professional opinion columnists. These are people like Thomas Friedman and Maureen Dowd and Nicholas Kristof and all the superstars that you love to read. They have deep narrative intuition. That's how they score. They probably can't tell you analytically how they end up with that many butts, but it's there. That is their brain shaping narrative day in and day out. So what I've done in the past week was to apply this to MedPage, which has been a medical publication that's been kind enough to let me publish 5 articles with them. And I said, what happens if we take a look at their editorials? They have 4 different types. And the main one that I've had my articles in is called Second Opinion. And lo and behold, it's down there with that editorial board it's actually 12, I think is the score, which is not very strong. And so, they think that they're publishing these editorials that are really compelling, but they aren't. They aren't drawing on narrative structure very much. Over the last 2 or 3 years, our whole group, we've done a number of other things that we've looked at. Last fall, I was invited by Limnology and Oceanography Journal to write an editorial for them. And I warned them, I said, if you're going to invite me to do this, I'm going to do something you may not like, which is I did exactly that. I took 25 of their editorials and showed them that's how they score. You're way down there. These are inner circle pieces that you're publishing, and you think they're broad editorials, and you give them broad titles, but really the text of it is not that readable for a bigger audience. Scientists, we took 25 papers from the Journal of Molecular Ecology. As expected, the narrative index gets even lower, and these are internal reports from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And as a basic general pattern, what you see is the science world is down there for narrative. This is what we've known all along. And the humanities have a much better grasp on narrative. So most people won't argue with that. This just gives you a quantitative perspective on it. Now, here's what I find most interesting is that in all the years I got to spend around the wonderful evolution of Stephen Jay Gould, one of his favorite topics was the exception that proves the rule. And that's what we've got right here, which is you look at that and look at that second opinion score, and you might pose the idea that, well, science and medicine just needs to be communicated way down there. It really doesn't lend itself to strong narrative structure. Well, here's the exception that proves the rule. The editor-in-chief at MedPage is a guy named Jeremy Faust, who is both a working ER doctor at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and he's Harvard educated, so academically superstar, real powerhouse, has his own column there called Faust Files that like once a week, I think he publishes an editorial. And look at how he scores for the narrative index. We've never seen scores this high. This guy is punching it out of the park week after week. And then you start reading some of them, and a lot of them are about COVID. They're all about life or death issues. They're very serious health issues. He's just a very powerful arguer who a lot of the paragraphs will have three butts in them, and they're all really well written. He knows how to distill down all of these elements into tight ABT structure. And that becomes the role model that you can point to all the others and say, it is possible to communicate your stuff a little more powerfully with narrative structure. So that's where we are with all that, Jeremy Faust. And then we've also known this, Bill Dennison, who's part of our group, 10 years ago. Two of his graduate students we had do the narrative index for Nobel laureate speeches in both physics and literature, posing the same question. And no big surprise, you notice the bulk of for both groups is in scored around 10 to 20, but the second biggest group for physics was down there under 10, meaning and stuff. They're just up there giving a speech where they're pouring out all the information of what they discovered. Whereas the literature people are, of course, they're scoring the same. That's what you get from the New Yorker feature articles is in the 20s. So we know there's this fundamental divide. And that circles then back around to this quote from Christopher Lochhead: nobody buys a solution without a problem. The science world, in my experience of 20 to 30 years of trying to motivate them to get interested in this stuff, fundamentally does not see it as a problem. And yet we look at the landscape and there's the results of all this bad communication, especially with COVID. And by the way, and we'll talk about this, but the nation is not ready for the next pandemic because they blew all the communication last time around. And I've not seen any sort of large scale studies to figure out where we went wrong. To the contrary, they've just swept it all aside and moved on with things. Okay, so that's the setup for today's wonderful discussion. We have got three folks from the public health world that we worked with. And in fact, you know what? I'm going to ask everybody if you could, everybody mute, and let's just see if for this first half an hour, if we can just kind of go one-on-one with my talking with the person and asking questions, and we'll maybe add to the group. But if everybody could right now, it probably would help for focus to just have just the one screen active. So if you could mute your screen and audio as well, then we'll get going here. So our three guests are Henry Blumberg from Emory University Medical School, and Steve Kern from the Global Health Labs, the CEO there in Seattle, part of the Gates Foundation world, and then Glenn Nowak, who was the head of communications for CDC. He's a professor now at University of Georgia. He'll fill us in more details on exactly where he works there. But on that note, and let's just have Henry. Let's start with you, Henry, and everybody else can mute. And I'll just have a little 5-minute conversation here with Henry. And let's see, on that note, I will stop sharing. And here we go. So, okay. And Glenn, if you want to mute as well, we'll just make it one at a time. So Henry, so 4 years ago, you got in touch with me, said, let's run the ABT course there in the medical school at Emory University. This fall will be the fourth time we're running it. And it's been a wonderful experience. I think, let's see, you can you can contradict what I'm saying, but the feedback has been great. And I know you guys just did some little event a few weeks ago where they asked us for, a bunch of details because they could present. They said, we want to brag about this course, and it's been really good. So give us the timeline on how you came across it and how it's gone with the ABT course.
Yeah, so I think I learned about you, Randy. I listened to a podcast that you were on, and so
Yeah, yeah,
I
right. Eric,
just,
Eric Topol, right?
yeah, so I just emailed you, and I didn't know if you'd email me back, but you did, and so we started a discussion, and yeah, I think I'm involved in our Clinical and Translational Science Award, Georgia CTSA, which is funded by NIH, and we're focused on a lot of different things, but the part I'm involved is research training. And as you mentioned, I think COVID highlighted that we do a terrible job. We did really no job in training scientists, junior scientists, or senior scientists for that matter, on how to communicate with the public. And I think it became very clear during COVID with all the messaging that, the communication to the public was not very good. And we do a lot of work training our young investigators on how to talk to other scientists, and they're very good at that. They learn, to do research, to write papers, to write grants, and so they're very good at communicating, in a scientific language with other other people. But as you point out, that's not the way to communicate with the public, and you need more narrative input. So that's kind of why we reached out to you, to help us out with the ABT and scientific communication for our junior investigators.
Yeah, and I generally don't like feedback when we're doing our courses, but you guys have forced that on us each
Yeah.
round, and they fill out the forms, and then I have Matthew screen them, and each time he says, "Well, I think you actually would enjoy reading these things." And some of the comments that have come back, I love. One woman said, "The only thing wrong with this course, it's not being taught to every medical student in the country." That was really nice. Another really cool comment was, when you come in from outside, like we're a bunch of weirdos compared to your medical school faculty. It's me sitting here with my surf photo over my shoulder. And you either from a group like your students are going to get like, why did you bring in these weirdos? We hate that they're different, or you get the polar opposite, which is what's cool about these people is that they're different. And that's what came back in some of the comments was there was an authenticity, the idea that we come from this different world, the real world out in the trenches, and that we don't speak the academic language. And that's been really nice. And then each year has gotten better with it. And this last year we added on the nailing it workshop, applying it to actually doing stuff. And in fact, that nailing it workshop was derived from what we did with GH Labs, and we'll talk about in a few minutes. And what about that little discussion that you guys, were you at that thing a few weeks ago that I think, is it Rachel? She made a presentation on the course and how it's been going. But any thoughts in general on
Yeah,
broader
I mean,
stuff?
we kind of evaluate everything we do, and so the course it's a formal course in the Emory Laney Graduate School, and so it has a course evaluation. But as you point out, our trainees really like it, and our trainees are kind of, they're PhD students, they're PhD postdocs, they're medical students, they're physicians who are interested in research, they're junior faculty. And so I think they've really enjoyed the course, and it's really, opened their eyes to that, you have to have different skill sets and you have to use narrative when you're communicating, with the public. It's different than communicating, to other scientists. And I think, overall, universities have done a really bad job training that. I think, maybe it's changing a little bit. COVID changed a little bit, but there's a long way to go.
Well, this idea of other people and their AI and everything picking up on the ABT now, we're seeing it pop up all over the place, like that website I just showed from this morning. And that's nice. It's just that most of the people, you can tell they don't quite know. They think it's just a little three-word thing. And as we know from the course, there's a lot more to it, but that'll just take time. Okay, thanks very much. So that's our first little intro. If we could have Steve jump in for 5 minutes. And yeah, you can mute, Henry, thanks. And so, Steve, about 3 years ago, got in touch with me. He's the CEO of GH Labs, Global Health Labs in Seattle. And we've been doing a bunch of stuff with them, including last year where we ran the training with your wonderful dozen interns there. It's been a really good experience. And you want to tell us a little bit of beginning and middle of how it's gone? How'd you come across ABT?
Yeah, so I mean I first heard of Randy, believe it or not, in 2008. You were interviewed on KUER in Salt Lake City by Doug Fabrizio in a program called Radio West because Flock of Dodos had just come out.
Right,
And
right.
listened to what you were saying, and I thought, well, this makes a ton of sense. And then bought your book, Don't Be Such a Scientist. And I thought, gosh, someday I'm going to hire this guy to come in and work with an organization where they have the capability to do that. So now that I control the budget, I have the capability to do that. So voila, right? So we brought you in, and it's interesting because at the time, I don't think you were you were talking about the structure in Don't Be Such a Scientist, but you hadn't really brought it into the ABT structure. And one of the things that I started to do with students that I found was really helpful. I used to have these pharmacy students. I ran a class where they had to do a literature report, and they would, give a presentation about some technology, and then try to convince their peers that they knew something about it. And it was all reading articles from journals. And one of the things I made them all do was finish their presentation with a haiku. And it was really interesting because the haiku, and if you think about it, right, haiku 575, right? It's basically it's the agreement, it's the kind of the condition,
Ah.
it's the contrast, right? And then it's the resolution. So it actually has a structural similarity to it. And one of the things that I found was that when you impose that structure, it translated back into their presentation, right? Then they go, oh yeah, okay, I'd start to think about it. And this came up, I think, maybe Shirley brought it up, or somebody brought it up last week, or no, it was John actually brought it up in his session, and that I caught at the end. That structure is oftentimes really helpful to force on people. And Henry, you were just talking about scientists speaking to scientists versus the public. I would argue it's not different, right? I mean, the biggest challenge and the advantage we've seen in our group is when our scientists then start talking to other scientists and they're using the ABT, they're getting reactions to conference presentations, to internal reports, to, a whole bunch of external audiences that are in their inner circle that are, saying, wow, that was really clear. I really got it. I really understand. Like they're getting perceptible reactions within their own community of this is actually helping me understand what you're doing and why it matters.
And what about you? Have you gotten any use out of the ABT?
Oh, I continue to all the time, right? So, I mean, I use it across a number of things in presentations, always in presentations to our sponsor, who's Bill Gates, and help him, essentially know exactly in a focused way, what are we working on, what are we trying to do, and what are we trying to achieve. And so, I think there's just a ton of opportunity to continue to develop this idea and use it in a much broader way than just, I wouldn't just even focus it on how do I make my abstract fundable to the NIH or get my paper accepted by, top tier journals. It's actually really being able to do that communication effectively. And it's really amazing when it starts to resonate, you're not saying contextually anything different, right? The material is all the same. You're just structuring it right. And you're allowing the scientists, I think, the thing that I think is happening, Randy, is that by forcing them to not and to death,
Mhm.
right? You are forcing them to have confidence in their knowledge. Because I think the whole reason scientists do the and is because they always, are harboring this imposter syndrome problem where they don't want anyone to call them out for something that they didn't see. So we just include the whole litany of history about this. That I know it all already, and then I can make my point to you. But the problem is that by me reciting the litany to you, I put you to sleep, and then you don't even hear about my great solution, right? So, so part of it is giving them the freedom to go, you don't have to do that. You already got the value because we invited you to come talk. So now let's focus just on what it is you want to impart to us in this session.
Yeah. Okay, great. And well, in a few minutes, we'll dig into the full conversation. I'm going to push a bit more on really some of the stuff that Bill Gates has been representing and pushing in trying to keep global health issues going and all of that sort of stuff in a time of crisis right now. And of course, last week we had John Room from the World Bank who talked about what you're saying there. He talked about ABT for leadership as even more powerful than just communication. So, okay, on that note, if we could have our third guest, Glenn, activate, jump in. And Glenn, 15 years ago, brought me to the CDC when he was head of communication. I think he came across my first book, Don't Be Such a Scientist. The first day I spent there in August of 2010 was one of the very best days of my entire professional life. It was tremendous. It was a full day that started in the morning with me meeting with the director, Tom Frieden, in a not particularly pleasant half an hour exchange. And then a whole day of oil and water, of being brought around by the communications people who were one community there who had brought me in. And we had done a conference call the week before with 6 of them. And it was like semi-crisis tone. They said it's so hard here working with the scientists. You've just published this thing. You've got the science background. Maybe you can connect with them better than we can because here's all the problems we run into. And then that whole day, they led me around in 3 different sessions. They brought me in rooms like 25 scientists to try and talk to them about importance of communication. And most importantly and memorably for me was just kind of the glow of everybody there, of the CDC, I think in its finest hour, possibly. You debate with me on whether that not that was its finest hour around 2010. And they were so proud of the place. And one of the things I got told twice that day was every year there's this survey that comes out about the most trusted institutions in the country. We always come in number 2. It's always Fort Knox that gets number 1. That's because they have all the gold. But after that, we're the most trusted institution, government institution in this country. And wow, how things have changed in 15 years. So, Glenn, can you give us a little insight of back then in 2010 and a few other details?
So first of all, just a small revision to my bio. So I spent 6 years at CDC as director of communications for the National Immunization Program, and I think when I brought you there, I was director of media relations for CDC. So,
Okay.
which was a somewhat distinct job from the director of communications and a job I never had.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for fine tuning that. Um,
But no,
and
I mean
what, yeah.
one of the things that I think you experienced was what I experienced when I first started working with CDC back in the early 1990s, and then when I became a Fed, what I experienced when I was one of the people who tried to help the scientists is that the scientists often focused on the problem, and they always thought that their solution was the best, and it was inherently obviously the best. I started working with the vaccine program, and day one, I was asked, "Why are you here? We don't need communications people. Vaccines speak for themselves." And what they failed to realize was that actually vaccines don't speak for themselves. Diseases, particularly severe disease outcomes and illness, speak for vaccines. And when that isn't present, which you don't want present, particularly at high levels, there is really nothing speaking for vaccines. And so, and I think the other thing I noticed, and it relates to the ABT framework, is that they often were really interested in storytelling, narratives, how to better tell their story. But I came to realize that for most of them, or probably all of them, what that really meant was they were conflating story with testimonial because they really didn't want, I mean, it kind of lines up with the and idea. They didn't want to put a but there for it was basically, we're doing great work, and let me tell you how great the work is, and here's the evidence of how my work is great.
And that same thing you're talking about was embodied in February 2022. There was a 4-page big review paper in Science from 30 some scientists from NIH congratulating themselves on the development of the vaccines, which is true. They did a heroic job with all that. But in the 18 paragraphs in that paper, only one paragraph mentioned, oh, by the way, we didn't do a great job with communication. Maybe we can work on that down the line. And I think that is exactly what went on was just that assumption that of course everybody will take this vaccine once it's ready. And even in 2010, there was people talking then about vaccine hesitancy already was beginning to be identified. And so much of this stuff of the anti-science movement and skepticism and everything developed over the course of 20 years, but the science world didn't really develop any strategy to identify and deal with it. And it kind of blindsided them. And I think now with RFK Jr. running everything, I mean, it's how did they not see all this coming? What do you think about that? How many discussions did you hear about the realization of how large this movement was becoming?
Well, I think it's really tough when you're dealing with experts in the field. I mean, who aren't communications people because they're looking at things like immunization rates, and you don't see that movement having a big impact. And even today, they're having a bigger impact, but back then it was not having a big impact. What they were doing was gaining attention and visibility beyond their numbers, and they were really good at that. Now, they had a lot of things that really helped. They had because they had small numbers, they could come to consensus on their stories. They could take liberty in terms of how they presented the stories. They could leave contextual information out. They could lie. They could do a lot of other things. And I think one of the challenges with people in public health is that most public health communications has to go through a clearance process. And as you get further and further along in that clearance process, you are less likely to encounter people who know anything about communications per se, because their communications expertise is conflating the word communications and information. And so, from their perspective, when they say they have a communications problem, what they typically mean is that we haven't presented enough information, or we have to present the information better in more places. They're not really talking about narrative structure, they're just talking sheer volume. And
Hmm.
their major operating assumptions include one is that all they're going to do is fill an information deficit. That you don't know enough, and I'll fill
Yeah.
that deficit, and now you'll come to think like I do. Or they come to believe that you just haven't heard it from the right person. And if we could just change the messenger,
Yeah.
it'll all be well.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see, Steve and Henry, could you guys reactivate and jump back in? Let's make it a little group now. And, one of the many great conversations I've had with you, Glenn, in those years since I first visited CDC, and I ended up doing 5 visits back then. It was really fun. It was exciting. And then, it all just began to unravel during the past 15 years. But there was one conversation we had where you talked to me about people don't understand the difference between public health communication and political communication, and they bring in a lot of these veteran communicators from the world of politics. That's exactly what they did at CDC. They, especially in the Biden administration, they brought in some veteran inside the Beltway communications experts to try and help run things at CDC, and eventually they didn't seem to have much of a clue on that. Can you say a few more words on that, the divide between?
Yeah, so when I started working with CDC, I was a professor at the University of Georgia, and I was a visiting communication scientist at CDC, and that was the early days of HIV/AIDS, and from that point to where we are today, every administration that came in would put more controls on and bring in more of their experts from the political campaign trail. And those people never understood public health, nor were they really interested in most instances because they were really political consultants and they were just looking for a parking spot between campaigns. And then they wanted to go back to the campaign world. They also had a whole different set of rules that guided them. So, for instance, when it came to media, if you're the media relations person for one of the final 2 presidential candidates in the United States, you can drive your media relations the way you want to. You can say, we're not going to talk to that reporter, and that reporter. We're going to say that reporter's story was bad. We'll never talk to them again. We're going to punish them. You can't do that if you work for a government agency or you're in public health. You have to deal with the reporters who are calling you, and you can't say, I can't talk with you. And then they also tried to constrain and limit what could be said so to make it match with their political ideology. And at that point, you're now transitioning from the foundation for the recommendations being high quality evidence to being your political ideology and your philosophies. And that makes it really hard. And I don't think when people see the content, they understand that that's what they're seeing or why they're seeing it.
Well, one of the things in my background was in the film years that I did after film school, and I made films for 15 years or so. And I had a couple that, one that was on Showtime, and I worked with 4 different PR firms around some of the film projects. And Hollywood publicists are the meanest, nastiest, most aggressive professionals that I've ever encountered. And they know how, especially the ones, and I got to know a few of them that were they manage major celebrity clients, that get into DUI situations and car wrecks, and they need to go out there and do damage control. And they know how to play hardball in that world. And it's just a battle. And so we've got that, the ugliness of the Hollywood PR control world. And then in that visit to CDC, that conference call that I had the week before, one of the things that somebody talked about in that call that stuck with me was they said, when we have an outbreak of a disease here at CDC, CNN is right here in town in Atlanta, and the reporters come running over, and we send out our spokespeople to talk with them, and they don't want to talk to the spokespeople. They want to get into the laboratory and talk to the scientists. They want to hear it from the horse's mouth, and that's the communication battle that you get, which is you can't let that happen because the scientists they don't know how to control the message. They're just going to pour out all the information and let the media people shape it the way that they want. Can you say a few things about that dynamic? You must have seen plenty of that.
Yeah, so oftentimes I think what happens that you don't realize initially is that when those reporters say they want to talk to the scientists, it starts out as a conversation about the science, like what did your study find? But what the journalists are ultimately most interested in is what does it mean and what should we do? And that's where you can have scientists disagree, and they did quite often at CDC in terms of things that you wouldn't think there'd be disagreement, like the symptoms of influenza. They could get into arguments about whether a certain symptom was actually an indication of flu or not flu. And so I think that's what made scientists both attractive to the journalists because they wanted the scientists to say this should be addressed today, it's urgent, and we need to do A, B, and C. And that scared the policy people, the people who were controlling the message, because they didn't want to be brought into something that quickly or by that way. They were like, wait, this should not come through us because the scientists at CDC or NIH or FDA said this is a serious health problem and we need to act now. They were like, no, you're supposed to just talk about your study, the methods, what you found, but don't get into the what we should do about it part of it.
Yeah, Steve, have you got thoughts on that? I see you nodding to that, the controlling the message.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge there, right, is people want to have predictability that comes out of those kinds of interactions and those interfaces. And so, I was thinking, as Glenn was talking, you probably came into CDC then, right? Not like just after the swine flu debacle, maybe that 5, 8 years after that or something like that. So, so CDC's been in this place before where they lost public confidence and they recovered phenomenally. And it'd be interesting to understand how they did that from the 70s to the 80s to then, where they were at their peak, I would say, certainly going into pre 2020.
Well,
And
and let me toss in adding to that because one of the key stories I heard when that first visit I did there was about the anthrax scare that
yeah,
happened after 9/11,
9/11,
and
right.
that they made a mess out of it there at CDC, and then they brought in a new director, and she came in, and the first speech she gave was that this is never going to happen again here, and they cranked up communications and hired a whole bunch of new people and developed the TV studio. Is that story reasonably correct, Glenn?
Yeah, so what happened was anthrax was a debacle, and I was director of communications for the immunization program, and I wasn't actually involved in the response, but I was involved in the postmortem, where we actually looked, why did that go so poorly, and how could we prevent it from happening again? And I think the biggest thing was at that point was the culture at CDC had not yet shifted, and Julie Gerberding was the CDC director you're referring to.
Yes. Yep.
Spokesperson, yeah.
Before Julie, all the directors and all the leaders at CDC really did not see the public or even most of the news media as germane to their operations. It was like, we're here to talk to our colleagues, we're here to talk to health departments, and to the extent that the public and some journalists are interested, that's great, but they never really took it seriously to the point that we need to learn how to listen to them and how to talk better to them.
Well, this idea of a postmortem assessment, that hasn't gone on for the pandemic. There should have been some, and it's gotten so politicized. I think what happened was that the left was terrified of any sort of interrogation of what went wrong with the pandemic. And so they haven't wanted to do any sort of, there should have been, after 9/11, there was the giant congressional investigation about how did 9/11 happen. And it seems to me there should have been that for why was the communication so botched in the pandemic? Why didn't they see this anti-vax movement coming? And that hasn't happened. And the net result is there doesn't seem to be any of that mindset of let's do a post-mortem. Is that your perception, Glenn?
Yeah, but I think it's because that's it's now so political and so much ideology driven that I think if you did an objective assessment, one of the things that you would quickly surface is that there were ideological differences that drove it and ideological preferences that drove it. And I think the people who were involved in it primarily, at least at the start, don't want that to be surfaced.
Okay, so one more question before we open up to everybody else asking questions. But for Henry, do you see political ideology all the way at the med school level emerging in discussions and things, or are things still fairly pure in the academic world there?
No, I mean, I think politics are, dominating everything, and you can see what's happening like with our federal agencies now.
Yeah, by the way, tell us about the T cell grant that got yanked. Um, I've told
Yeah,
Steve about that.
Oh
What,
my
why
God.
did it get terminated?
yeah, because I think, Doge was going through NIH with, with AI word searches, and there are certain words that are no longer, allowable with the current administration. So diversity was one. And so there were some grants that aren't DEI related at all, but like, T cell diversity. And so these things got kind of flagged in these AI word searches, and some of those grants got canceled. I mean, it's crazy.
Did they get reactivated, or are they really?
I don't know. There's a big lawsuit also going on now, about this, and I think there was a judge's ruling a few days ago that it was
Wow,
illegal, but I'm sure that the government's going to appeal that. So
that's crazy.
Yeah, and Randy, there was a line in your most recent book, the Lincoln but Trump, that really struck me when I was reading through it, and it was that point about ABT is hard when you care about the truth. ABT is easy when you don't, or easier, I should say, and I think that's where you get into some of the problem of scientists going, oh, that's a tool that charlatans use, that ABT kind of thing. That's the way people, sway, infomercials and get all kinds of crazy solutions with bleach adhered to, right? And
Yeah.
so that's one of the challenges you find is that it's hard to do when you do it well. And so people have seen examples, too many examples of it being done with non-truth. And that's a lot easier to do because you can just make anything up, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, everybody's welcome to now activate and jump into the whole group discussion and time to ask some questions to these folks. And Dean, how about if you take the lead? I see you made a comment there and you've always got a good question ready to go. Take it away, Dean.
So this is just going, way back to his comment. I think it was Henry made early on about the idea that vaccines were just going to sell themselves. I mean, this idea that we're all alive because of vaccines. So why do we need to tell anyone about this? It's kind of obvious. The idea that we're here because something didn't happen, because we didn't die, is not intrinsically communicating itself.
Yeah.
Unless someone pounds the hell out of that somehow, that becomes invisible. And I think that's been a core problem with vaccine understanding or vaccine acceptance at this point. We're not dead, and nobody cares.
No, the issue was when I joined the immunization program in 1998, and I was new to vaccines, but I was struck by how ingrained in the culture that was, the notion that vaccines spoke for themselves. And then I realized that it wasn't surprising in the sense that most of the people who were heading up immunization programs had deep experience in eradicating smallpox, eradicating polio, reducing measles, and they were out in the field and they could see the impact of vaccines. They could see people embrace vaccines. They could see people welcome vaccines. And as that sort of faded away because vaccines did their job, they eliminated those diseases, they mistook it for vaccines speak for themselves. And the other thing is they were deeply grounded in a notion that any money that they got from Congress or from whatever for vaccine efforts should go to vaccine. Because again, vaccines spoke for themselves. So if you got $100 to spend on vaccination, you should try to spend 98 of it on the vaccines because you just got to get it to them, and that's the other $2. And the doctors and nurses who administer them will somehow just inherently know about the value of vaccines. And that culture has been slow to change, even in even in the face of vaccine hesitancy. And it's not really where it needs to be today to be effective.
Well, just every single person who works on vaccines was convinced. Yeah, it was obvious to them that this was, a magical and amazing thing, forgetting the fact that there's the 99.999% of the world that doesn't work on vaccines and didn't necessarily get it.
Yeah. I mean, the person who's the exception to that, Dean, is Don Burke. So Don is a classic global health warrior, eradication of smallpox, worked under D.A. Henderson at Hopkins. So he comes from this whole pedigree of people that have been in that space. And he, as the dean at Pittsburgh in the public health school, they had funded this entity they called Fred, and they purposely named it Fred after Fred Rogers. And it basically was this public health communication system where he digitized all of the CDC's, weekly mortality rates back to the 1880s. And when they had the outbreak of measles in Disneyland in California, he went with his team to the representative and just showed them this information. And it's present. You can still find it on what's called Fred, right? At University of Pittsburgh. And he basically was able to convince this congressperson who was resistant to voting, for increasing vaccination that, oh my God, I get the point. And all he could show was mortality differences that happen. You could look and see death by disease by introduction of vaccine. And it's so consistent across so many different diseases. That's why they all thought, well, of course, any rational person would think this way, right?
Okay, so let me now toss in something. And Henry, this is when you first met me through that podcast I did with Eric Topol. This was one of the moments in the podcast, which was I told him that there ought to be a government simple, straightforward campaign about the fact that vaccines work. This was the hat that I had made up, and I put it on in the middle of the whole thing. And a whole bunch of emails and comments came in like, yes, yes, we need to do that whole thing. They didn't. Nobody did. And sadly, but this is exactly that issue, which is there should have been a campaign, ideally somewhere run 10 years ago, that just explains, just reinforces to the public vaccines do work. And it's building trust like that as opposed to making this assumption. And that's where this inner circle, outer circle dynamic becomes so important, because when everybody's living in the inner circle, they have those assumptions. Well, everybody knows vaccines work. No, they
Yeah.
really don't. They need to have it argued to them. The simplest of things is a lot of what we do with the ABT is it's that blue material of what sorts of things do you really need to go out of your way and explain to people that this is why we do this stuff. This is why it's important. Andy Reynolds, have you got something you want to say? I'm guessing you got some comment question by now.
Well, I didn't want to miss this session. I'm sorry that I was able to join only a few minutes ago. We here at the National Committee for Quality Assurance in Washington are dazed and confused, dazed and amazed by where the culture has evolved or devolved. And I'm afraid I don't have any answers other than to double click or reinforce that those of us who work in the nerdy technocratic corner of healthcare that is quality improvement, we too thought, well, who could be against quality? Or who could be against,
That's it.
your child not getting measles? And I guess one question I have, Randy, is yes, but yes, it in retrospect would have been nice if there were a reinforcing campaign to remind or reassure everyone that vaccines work. But if you have to do that for vaccines, you would have to do that. Like, do we have to do that for seatbelts and everything else, every other technology? I just
Well,
wonder if the
not necessarily,
cacophony.
but it is a mindset. And this is one of the things I've said over the years about Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. It suffered from that same thing, this assumption that climate scientists are, we all know they're our heroes, and let's listen to them. And the public didn't know that. And there was a story that should have been told at the beginning of that movie, which was once upon a time, the whole planet was threatened by an atmospheric problem. And all the nations in the world came together and solved that problem. It was the ozone hole in the 1980s, and they came up with the Montreal Protocol. They should have opened that movie by telling this simple story that basically climate science works. You just have to hit that theme first. But when you're heavily academic and informational, you bypass those assumptions and you just assume everybody's already there at the starting point. And that's the arrogance of needing to come down from the pedestal to the average people. And a lot of science groups don't want to do that, I think. Yeah, further thoughts on that coming down from on high to relate to the public? um, Julie
Can I?
Clausen, have you got some thoughts on coming down since you're going to be doing that next week in DC?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so fascinating to me how things, I mean, to me, it seems like they turned quickly, but obviously this is something that has been brewing for a long time. And the one thing that is what's the heart of the problem? What's the crux of the problem? And is it that people don't accept the science about this thing, about coffee or about vaccines? Or is it that we have just failed to tell people how science is done, right? Do people understand the scientific method? Do they, are they just, they're so ignorant on how science, how we
Well, yeah, okay, but
achieve
that gets into
science.
one of our long-term issues here, which is these two different schools of thought. And there's this age-old thing in the science world of the public understanding of science. It originated in the 1950s in the UK, and it's this belief that we've got to make the science, the public science literate. And the reality is the public never will be science literate. They don't care to be. It's the science community that needs to understand the public better. And they refuse to do that. And it's just constantly, you'll see all
Right.
these editorials in Science and Nature about,
Well,
you know,
I think
what's that? Uh-oh. Lost the connection there. Steve, did you want to add to something to that?
No, I just completely agree with you. I think
science
that's
is not a answer. It's a continuation.
Let's say that
What I
again,
would
Julie.
say,
You
I
locked
guess,
up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I've got an unstable internet. In today's headline society, right? You get an answer for one thing that's healthy one day, and then the next day it's bad for you. So there's a frustration. And if you understand how science is done, right, that it's always growing, it's always, you got to look at sample size, you have to look at this. I agree, you can't get public to understand the details, but if you can get an appreciation of at least the scientific method, you have made some headway.
I don't know that that'll ever happen either.
no,
There just isn't the bandwidth. Glenn, you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've encouraged people to not use the word science in terms of, when you're trying, because science is, as you described, it's complex, it's a process. What's more relatable to an everyday person is evidence, and they can understand the quality of evidence. And you can teach them about that by saying things like, you're looking for a restaurant to go to tonight. You could get, evidence from Yelp. Um, one Yelp review is evidence, but it's really poor. 1,000 Yelp reviews is high quality, is better quality evidence. And I think if we focused on the outcome of doing good science, which is high quality evidence, rather than you need to know about the process, which is this thing called science, which can yield different results and inconsistent results. At the end of the day, even we as scientists judge the results of science by the quality of the evidence that they obtained, right? So I think, and then I can talk to my brother who's a mechanic about evidence, and it makes sense. I don't know if I use the word science, I'm going to keep him in that conversation very long.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
Can, can
Greg
I
Tillman, filmmaker, you got a comment?
totally a non-scientist, which is why I have this comment, which is, and it kind of goes to what you were just saying there, Randy. I think one of the things that it seems to me from outside that science doesn't really do is it doesn't work to understand why that resistance exists. What is it that makes people afraid to take a vaccine? And sometimes I think all the information in the world, all the truth, all of the results still won't get people to give up whatever it is that they're using, that resisting thing that is keeping them from doing that. And if you guys can figure out what that is, you may have a whole different story to tell to remove that so that they can then accept
Well,
the
that's
science you guys
and
have.
what you're hitting on is what I was just saying, which is the
Yeah.
difference between the public understanding of science versus the scientific world's understanding of the public. And there just isn't, I think there's not enough work done on that. I mean, that's my experience. I've written 12 books, and not any of these organizations call me in for any conversations. They're just not thinking in those terms. They're just constantly saying, if we can just bombard the public with more facts and detail, it's endless like that. Henry, you got something to say on that?
I was just going to say, I mean, one thing Francis Collins, who was the former director of NIH, said is that, one thing he underestimated was the vaccine hesitancy, and they needed to invest more
Yeah.
at NIH to, on behavioral research around that. And so recently there had been a number of grants, but the first thing that the current administration and, the head of HHS did is they canceled out every vaccine hesitancy grant at NIH. Like they don't want the research on it. So I mean, it's just the times we're living in. But I agree with you. We need to understand this a lot better. I don't think, we fully understand it. And again, the way we communicate,
Yeah.
needs to
Well,
change too.
so let's see. First off, let's go to 10 minutes after the hour. We almost always cut these things off, but because we got three experts here today, let's add an extra 10 minutes and then we'll cut it at 10 after the hour. So that gives us 15 more minutes right now. Henry, you and I tried to get published an editorial that was about this basic phenomenon that is, again, the science world ought to be running entire big studies on this, which in the simplest of all levels, how is it that you can have an earthquake in Mexico City and 10,000 people die? And on the evening news, as they report that, they end with the story of the one child that got pulled out of the rubble, and everybody walks away feeling good for the day. That's narrative at work. That's the distortion. That is not fact-based. That's not sample size. It's not nothing. It's this fundamental divide between narrative versus numerical thinking. And Henry and I wrote a draft of an editorial, and he tried to get it published in two or three or four different venues. And just you can't get these things published because the reviewers don't see that as being relevant and interesting because they're all in that realm. I don't know what to say about it. It's nice that we're making some progress with the ABT, but in this new book, I talked about what I called the non-narrative conundrum, which is that almost everybody out there operates their lives all day long in the default mode of non-narrative. And when you start talking about ABT, they don't know what in the world you're talking about. The whole chapter I have in there about the World Bank, that's what happened there. A guy tried to change the system, and everybody there at the World Bank was all non-narrative. And like, what is this nonsense? We're not going to waste our time trying to worry about this narrative structure. So it becomes endlessly challenging to address those things. Yeah, Andy.
I just wanted to say that, in my opinion, the issue is not so much that the medical or scientific establishment is arrogant. It's more a matter of ignorance. And the only analogy I can think of there is in our world, quality assurance, we feel like we're invited to conferences, we're invited, say, call it to a game of pickup basketball. And we show up, and it turns out that their ball isn't round. the audience's ball is a football. It's oblong. And so we're kind of stunned. Wait a minute. You can't dribble this oblong thing. This isn't basketball. I thought we were here to play basketball. And so that's an admittedly kind of silly or facile analogy to point out that I feel like in our world, we show up and then are completely disoriented or stunned to find out the fundamentals of no, what you thought was a round ball that bounces is an oblong ball that doesn't bounce very well. That's completely disorienting. And it's not so much ignorance as then, holy hell, well, if we were so wrong about that, or if we have to like go back to those basics, what else do we have to
And
redo?
that's sort of
So again, I don't think
cultural
it's
divide.
arrogance, it's ignorance.
Well, and that's kind of
Yeah.
cultural divide, different cultures clashing up against each other. Steve, you had a comment?
Yeah, but we don't know how to handle that challenge, right? And I think maybe, Randy, let's go back to what you said about Stephen Jay Gould of the exception proves the rule, right? Because you
Mhm.
just gave an example with Henry of, well, earthquakes killed 10,000 people, but one person survived. Therefore, people latch onto that one person and go, I can survive an earthquake, right? Forgetting about the 10,000 next to that person who died, or, the one guy who walked away from that Air India crash just last
Yeah,
week, right? That's
that's
just
right.
craziness, right?
Yeah.
So part of the problem is we don't know how to explain the exception. That's what I like about what Glenn was saying with evidence, because you can think of it as a pile of stuff. You're going to always have people out there that are, regardless, aren't going to accept whatever you tell them. They're going to hang on to the outlier. Fine, we can't do anything about them. But the majority of people, you can move in the right direction if, again, you get out of this certainty arrogance and saying, yeah, this is a body of evidence, we're building it, and it's amassing in this way and telling us how we go forward. But that makes people really uncomfortable because they think it makes science squishy.
Well, I'm going to say one rather unpleasant thing that a bunch of people are going to hate me for saying this, but the
We
the
count on
one,
that.
two characters on this topic of what we're talking about with that earthquake phenomenon, that's the problem of media dynamics. Marshall McLuhan in the early 1960s first put his finger on it, and with his foundational book in 1964 said, we got a problem here. We're turning into a media-driven society, and people don't understand how media works. They've never really understood how media works. And I'll tell you from my perspective, I'm sorry to say this, but in all the articles and talk and everything that I read right now, there's only one person I hear speaking that language who gets that. And that person is Steve Bannon. And I'm sorry, but in his interview with David Brooks, he talked about Marshall McLuhan and he talked about how Trump emerged. And everybody on the left is just flummoxed, but well, that's not relevant. Well, they're having their way. It's a different world today, and this media stuff is totally confusing, and social media is even that much more confusing. So that's part of the tilted landscape, I think.
The best public health warrior on this was Hans Rosling. So and Hans, if you ever watched any of his presentations, was magical at basically being able to put together graphical information and storytelling in a narrative context that was really strong. And he wrote this book called Factfulness that's really a good read. And every time my wife starts fussing too much about the headlines, I just remind her of the chapter in Factfulness that talks about, well, newspapers don't get subscriptions by people saying nothing happened in Los Angeles today, right? And so again, I think context and the volume of evidence and the body of evidence is really key. And one of the things that Rosling pointed out is scientists we often overestimate the significance of a problem we're working on, right? Because we're so focused on it, we're so in the trenches, we think, oh my God, everybody's going to have this problem. When in fact, we don't take the big picture in ourselves because it's just not the way we're normally wired to think. So we have to pull up and look at the whole environment and really understand how does our piece fit into it and accept when, hey, it's only a 5%, but that 5% is an important 5%, and here's why.
Well, and adding on to that, something I cite endlessly is Michael Crichton was the other fellow that really did understand this because he had the split background of both science and then eventually cinema and all that sort of stuff. And in his last interview with Charlie Rose in 2007, the year before Crichton died, there's one little snippet in there where he talks about the dinner party. And he says, this is just how it works. If you're at the dinner party and you say to everybody, everything's pretty good in the world right now, nobody's interested. But if you say we're about to next week, it's all going to end, you get all the attention. That's ABT. That's just the power of contradiction. And there's just not enough understanding of how that power of contradiction drives all this stuff. And here we have the most contradiction driven president in the history of this country who has sailed all the way up to the upper levels with that. And we can show it with the narrative metrics. He's the only politician that scores over 30 routinely with his speeches. There's something there, and yet, it's been 10 years of me grinding away to try and get some traction on that. And Julie Clausen, did you want to add to that about the application of the ABT to dinner parties?
No, just that it just is endless for its uses.
Yeah. Uh,
Randy, I got a question. I couldn't find the hand button. Sorry.
sure.
Um,
Yeah,
you
Navid, who's worked with us a bunch. Yes. How are you
well,
doing?
good, good. Nice to see you. Nice to see Steve and other familiar faces, Charles. My question, we're talking about this divide of you can't get the public to really understand the scientific literacy. The sort of medicine science person me wishes that were the case, but recognizes, okay, it might not. But I think what could be very helpful is in this evolving landscape, I think people appreciate transparency. But if, as evidence, as I think that's a great word instead of science, comes in, can the public not get better at recognizing on day two, we're going to say, this is what we know at this point in time. And when on day five, it could be a 180, it could be a 90 degree. If people were more understanding of that, I would think, because then if they're not, and it's sort of jarring, and I think someone, maybe as Julie was saying, yeah, you see one headline, red meat is good for you, red meat's bad for you, and it's like, well, now I can't trust anything. Trying to see like how can we do a better job of having the public understand that what we're saying, trusting that it's the most accurate data in that time, and that things could change, but that doesn't mean we were trying to be,
Well, I
bamboozle
think
you.
all that starts with this science world understanding the public. And that all begins by understanding narrative and understanding this earthquake phenomenon and these sorts of things that aren't as simple as just proportionality. But unfortunately, for example, when you take a look, and Glenn, see if you got some thoughts on this. But the Biden administration came in, they put together two advisory boards. Matter of fact, Glenn, you may remember you introduced me to Michael Osterholm, and for 4 or 5 months, he and I had a somewhat productive collaboration. And he gave me insights into that first advisory board that the Biden administration put together. And the whole thing was a blue ribbon panel of academic credentials of doctors, PhDs, MPHs, all of them. There were no communication experts in there, and they would have their Zoom sessions, and I would talk to Osterholm the next day, and I would say, "Where are the communications people?" And he would say, "This echoed what I heard there at CDC in that first visit." He said they were on the call, they just don't speak up. And that group, that conference call I had the week before I came for that first visit, there was people on there that talked about we get in these meetings with the scientists and they're bullies and they trample us with knowledge and information, and we don't know how to argue back with them about communication dynamics when all they're saying is you don't even understand this field. You're trying to go out and communicate about this disease. You don't know that it's caused by this and this and this. And there's just that mismatch. That was my experience at CDC. I walked away with is this very unfair bullying dynamic. And then just a few weeks later, I was at NASA where we had at the end of the day 8 people in a room, all communicators. It was basically a support group for victims of scientist abuse. And all of them told stories about being yelled at by scientists for getting things wrong or whatever. And, I'm sorry, but to me, in my experience, arrogance is a major part of the whole thing. And we all want to think idealized visions of scientists, but sorry, I did the two careers. I've spent the time around them, and it's an inevitable trait that goes with the landscape, in my opinion. I might be wrong about that. Glenn, you got any thoughts to add to that with that group telling me that before that visit about bullying?
No, I mean it makes sense. I mean, when I first started working with CDC, I had the good fortune to be at UGA, and I was a visiting communication scientist. And my first projects for over the span of 9 years were in HIV/AIDS prevention. And early on in that, doing those projects, one of the projects was an idea that CDC had was they're going to do knowledge transfer. They were going to send experts out to communities to tell them how to do better HIV/AIDS prevention. It didn't take long when you got off the plane and you were in those communities to realize if that was what you were going to do, it was going to be very ineffective because you were going to be, they challenged you. They were like, what do you know about Kansas City? You've never been to Kansas City.
Yes.
We don't think that your methods or whatever you think you're. And so what we really learned, the ones that were most successful, pivoted quickly to, you're right. I want to listen. Tell me. And then I was involved in projects where we went out to help communities figure out how to spend CDC HIV/AIDS prevention dollars. Should it be on research? Should it be on prevention? Should it be on treatment? We went into those meetings knowing that we were not loved, that the group was going to, community town hall was going to be divisive. And it was going to go a lot better if we acknowledged our shortcomings, that we didn't know the area,
Mm,
and we listened and
mm.
we understood their stories and we developed relationships. And then by developing those relationships, we could come back after repeated visits and they would begin to develop trust. We would learn and we would modify us. And so it was collaboration. And that's, I think, the part that you have to get to. It has to become collaborative, not one way.
Okay, on that very word trust, that's a good final theme for us to work on for a few minutes here because when Trump left office after his first term and Biden came in, the new director he brought in from North Carolina, I've forgotten her name, but she said, you know, goal number one is to reestablish trust. And I don't see that she succeeded much of anything there. And of course, now it's all just unraveled downhill. Can you say a few more things to us about trust and CDC and where things are right now with that?
Well, there's probably very little trust because there's very little engagement. There's very little communications coming from people who are either communications people or actually involved in running CDC. So that's going to, and to the extent that they're not involved, it means it becomes political. And then we know in this country that, 50% of people are over here and 50% are over there. And so you're starting from a position where no matter what you do or say, half the America doesn't trust you. So I think you have to move into a space that I don't know that we're even close to getting back to these days. But that's you develop trust by talking to people, listening to people, showing them that you've heard them, and doing that repeatedly. You can't develop trust by saying, trust me. Usually it's a really good way to lose trust.
Okay. All right. You hit on our grand synthesis statement for this whole session. You can't develop trust by just saying, trust me. And that is a perfect note to wrap this all up on. We could go for another hour or two. This has been exactly the discussion I anticipated it would be. Thanks to all three of you, the guests, and everybody else that joined in. We've recorded this. I'll send it out in the next day or so. But this is really, really fun and interesting and onward and upward. And then next week will be our final one before we take the break off for July, and then we'll come back first week of August. But next week will be with let's see, with the lawyers, and that will be a huge amount of fun. So okay, everybody have a good time, and we'll see you back here in a week. Thanks, you guys. That was wonderful.
Yeah.